Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. Thank you for joining us.
Well, good morning. It is a deep joy to be preaching here at First Unitarian Society as I live just down the street from this congregation. I'm excited for the journey you are on with your interim minister, Yulin Stoneberg, who I have had the pleasure of welcoming into a Twin Cities UU clergy small group that I'm a part of. I'm grateful for this invitation to share some of my dissertation research with you all today. So let's begin. For our Christian neighbors, this is the season of Advent, the season of waiting and anticipating the birth of Jesus and the hope and possibility that brings. I don't know about you, but I'm not feeling excited or hopeful about the future possibilities for our country as we hear news about cabinet picks and policies from the incoming administration. Policies that will disenfranchise, harm, and destroy many families and lives. Instead of the anticipation of Advent, I want to cling to the last remaining days of the Biden administration with all of my might. As people of humanist faith, faith in human potential and possibility, what can give us hope right now to resist and fight against oppressive and unjust policies? What theologies from our humanist tradition can we draw upon in this time when many of us are feeling dread as the new year approaches? For me, working on my dissertation on theologies for racial justice has given me a place to find hope, a place to find language that inspires and renews my faith. Language that also might help our denomination respond to the critique from the UUA's important report, Widening the Circle of Concern, which conducted an audit of white supremacy in our denomination. In the theological section, the report argues that addressing the perennial problem of race in Unitarian Universalism has not been understood broadly as a theological mandate. The report says, quote, "We have not invested in developing the theological resources that could have allowed us to have a vocabulary of faith to meet the challenges of the 21st century." My dissertation addresses, and I hope will make a significant theological contribution toward rectifying this devastating critique. In my dissertation, I offer 4 theological trajectories that can help us more deeply ground our racial justice work. Today, I will preach on one of those trajectories, something I am calling African American naturalistic humanism. But you might be wondering, what does it mean to theologically ground our racial justice work? Anytime we talk about theology, and yes, even humanist theology, we are talking about something beyond our smallness. A liberating theology should help us articulate a sense of meaning and ethical orientation, helping us envision the world we would like to bring into being. For our liberal religious heritage that values pluralism, reason, and science, perhaps theology should also be judged, in the words of Sally McFaig, on their fruitfulness for living, their ability to light up human existence in profound ways, and their compatibility with contemporary knowledge, and finally, their empirical fit. Humanist theology is definitely compatible with contemporary scientific knowledge, but adding concepts from religious naturalism gives us the ability to also light up human existence in profound ways. So as you are all well aware, stating plainly, humanism is the recognition that humanity is fully and solely accountable and responsible for the human condition and the correction of humanity's plight. However, critics sometimes accuse humanism of exaggerating the importance of human beings. Humanists smuggle God in through the back door by deifying the human. I know. Religious philosopher Carol Wayne White provides an antidote to this problem by marrying humanism with what she terms religious naturalism. Naturalism is the basic conviction that any truths we are ever going to discover and any meaning in life we should uncover are revealed to us through the natural order. White encourages us to reflect meaningfully on the emergence of life from the Big Bang forward, promoting an understanding of nature as complex processes of becoming. For White, the scientific epic becomes the starting point for positing an African American religious humanism, constituted by a central tenet: humans are relational processes of nature. In short, we are nature made aware of itself. We become more aware of our nature when we ask ourselves fundamental questions, like what is the meaning and purpose of our existence? White contends that on a molecular level, there is evidence to support the idea that in the very nature of life itself, there is some essential joining force that connects us one to another, and she describes this connection as sacred. White explains this orientation toward joining with others in establishing our common humanity is what she imagines when using the phrase sacred humanity. Humans are, by our very constitution, relational, and our wholeness occurs within a matrix of complex interconnectedness. In this context, our sacrality has fundamentally to do with ways of conjoining with others that transform us. I think that's what we do here in religious community. We join together in ways that transform us. It's also important to note that White does not use the term sacred to connote something that is grounded in a supernatural reality. Rather, for White, the term sacred is an affirmation and appreciation of that which is fundamentally important in life, or that which is ultimately valued, relational nature. Humans are interconnected parts and processes of nature, and our sacrality is a given part of nature's richness, spectacular complexity, and beauty. For White, sacred humanity is also an apt descriptor of African Americans' intent on humanizing their existence in the face of dehumanizing gestures and tactics by the dominant white culture. White is naturalizing the Christian concept of imago Dei, that we are made in the image of God. We are not sacred, she would argue, because God created us, but because we are a part of the interconnected web of existence. So you might be wondering, how does White's naming of African Americans as sacred humanity ground our racial justice work? What are the ethical fruits of this African American naturalistic humanism? The first ethical fruit of this theology is that it culminates in declaring and celebrating humanity, specifically African American humanity, as sacred, despite persistent and dehumanizing anti-Black racism. As we prepare for the further erosion of laws that protect and defend African American civil rights, I can think of no greater reason to embrace White's call to proclaim and celebrate African Americans as human, as having the right to become our humanity. Unitarian Universalists must contest and reject impoverished models of Black animality conceived by cultural spin doctors mesmerized by distorted racial constructs. So one example of how we Unitarian Universalists and this congregation specifically can cherish all forms of humanity as sacred and contest racism is in our ongoing support, or if we're Black, participation in Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, which is nicknamed BLUE. BLUE's mission is to harness love's power to combat oppression and foster healing as a spiritual and political imperative. In the 6 years since its founding, BLUE has transformed from a small informal gathering of Black UUs into an impactful organization that creates life-giving and life-saving opportunities for spiritual community and Black-centered organizing. The ultimate goal of BLUE is justice-making and liberation for Black people through our faith. Only when the most marginalized of our society are free, then we will all truly be free. I invite you to consider supporting BLUE and other Black-led organizations to affirm that only when Black lives matter will all lives truly matter. A second ethical fruit of African American naturalistic humanism can be found in the lessons from the myth of Sisyphus. I hope you all know the myth, but in case you don't, it's that story where the gods punish Sisyphus for refusing to stay in the land of dead, and Zeus punished him by giving him a rock, and he has to push the rock up the hill only to have the rock roll down, and he has to do this over and over. And I'm wondering about you, but in the wake of mass deportation, ongoing gun violence in our communities, and the devastation of our planet, I can often feel pretty darn hopeless that my efforts for justice don't amount to much, or worse, are even a waste of time. So how might we as UUs find the motivation and the hope to continue working for justice in this morally ambiguous universe we find ourselves in? Borrowing from Camus, African-American scholar and professor Anthony Pinn wonders, as the reading suggested, is the proper response to ongoing oppression and racism suicide? If suicide is not the proper response, Pinn asks, is there something despite the absurdity involved that we humans may grab hold of and anchor ourselves to as that which constitutes the reason life should continue? Pinn explains that the myth of Sisyphus can represent both our private struggles as individuals as well as our need for community. The challenge to imagining Sisyphus happy can be grounded in an ethical stance that asks that we work to advance the potentialities of life for ourselves and for others, despite the all too persistent sorrows, in a world where many injustices are never acknowledged, much less remediated, and most victims die anonymously. As we continue to work, Pinn encourages us to locate success in the process. We maintain our justice efforts because we have the potential to affect change, and we measure the value of our work not in terms of outcomes achieved, but in the process of struggle itself. More robust occupation of time and space is the norm, he says. Perpetual rebellion is the process, and struggle is our last best option. But Pinn also reminds us that we don't have to struggle alone. Pinn encourages us to reject the noble individual who shoulders down and pushes only for themselves, an utterly miserable approach. Instead, African American humanism does better through a turn to the individual within the context of community, like what we do here at FUS. Pushing that rock up the hill need not be a lonely and individualistic enterprise. We do the hard work of justice together in community, while holding ourselves accountable to that community. In struggle, we find a new kind of hope, one that is applicable to humanists working to turn punishment into possibility, angst into awareness, and repetition into resistance. We remain committed to the work for justice by celebrating the sheer strength of human will, solidarity with our neighbor, and the integrity of our goals, despite knowing that these may not be enough to win the day. The rock is going to fall back down. But echoing the Buddhist concept of non-attachment, I find Pinn's notion of finding contentment in the struggle itself liberating and downright hopeful, because it encourages communities to ground their work for racial justice in the present moment, despite no guaranteed outcome. When we renew our justice efforts, knowing that struggle is what we have to offer, UUs may experience a glimpse of the spiritual wholeness promised in the eighth principle. The process of struggle and the effort involved is the reward, so to speak. That is to say, struggle isn't a means to an end. It is what we have, what we can muster based on human potential and tendencies. Struggle then loses its negative connotation and instead marks out a positive push to the extent it speaks to agency and regard for life over against death-dealing policies and practices. Sometimes when we work together, the rock actually gets to the top of the hill, at least temporarily. For example, many UUs worked to support legislation at the state capitol this past session that enshrines abortion rights in the state, money for affordable housing, and makes Minnesota a sanctuary state for gender-affirming care. Locating hope in the struggle itself doesn't mean we don't take time to celebrate our wins when the rock reaches the top. We should indeed celebrate these and other successes with each other and in community. Joy, beauty, and yes, rest are our birthright too. But my heart does ache with the knowledge that millions of people who have suffered injustice and oppression often die anonymously and will never get justice. If I am honest, sometimes I desperately wish I could believe in a transcendent God that will ensure cosmic justice in some promised end time. But my knowledge and experience of the world does not lead me to this conclusion. Instead, my hope for us is to embrace the life and ethical fruits that African American naturalistic humanism makes possible. Ethics and moral codes that value the web of life, of which humanity is a small part, and summons us to work to improve the arrangements of collective and individual life without any sort of divine assistance. Even in the face of certain physical death, our common human destiny, African American humanism and its ethics invites UUs to act without appeal, to bring about meaning in a world defined by the absurdity of anti-Blackness and racial oppression. The moral arc of the universe may not bend towards justice on its own, but in the human realm, we can act to make such an arc possible and expected by choosing to declare Black lives our sacred humanity and persevering in the struggle for racial justice. In the face of certain death and the failure of our most cherished hopes, including bringing an end to white supremacy, we as UUs commit ourselves to persevering in the struggle, mourning our losses and sorrows, yet holding to the audacity for joy. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.